In February of this year, Western countries imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia, limiting exports, freezing capital reserves. This was expected to really damage the Russian economy, with the IMF predicting a fall in GDP of 8%. In reality, the collapse in the Russian economy hasn't occurred and it held up better than some expected. And also, Russia has retaliated by restricting gas supplies to Europe, and this has caused real economic hardship, pushing up gas prices, causing inflation, and pushing Europe into recession. It is said that in war there are only losers, and this is similar with economic sanctions. The economic conflict between Russia and Europe is causing a loss of economic welfare on both sides. But who is suffering the most? Let us start with Russia. Although the economy has fallen less than expected, many analysts say that the official figures mask the underlying reality. A report by Yale University earlier in the year argued that the Russian economy was actually doing much worse than official statistics. They said that there was evidence of falling in consumer confidence, fall in investment, capital outflows, and people leaving the country. Also, the diminished access to Western technology is severely hampering Russian industry because it's short of key components like microchips, ball bearings, all of which can put a limit on production. And some industries like the airline industry are really struggling to get workable planes. And over the coming months and years, this lack of access to Western technology will become increasingly difficult for Russia. Also very important is the loss of young working people. It is estimated between February and August, around 500,000 Russians left the country. But this has been made worse by the partial mobilization Putin announced in September. 300,000 Russians have been called up, but this has caused a rapid flight of more Russians to try to leave the country. It is estimated over 360,000 have left to neighbouring countries like Kazakhstan and Georgia, with more trying to get out to avoid getting conscripted. And this has very severe economic consequences because Russian industry are losing skilled people, which are hard to replace, and the lack of labour supply is particularly a problem for Russia because of its demographic changes. It has a very low birth rate, around 1.5, and also can't rely on net migration to fill in labour vacancies. And so Russian industry faces two simultaneous problems. It can't access basic import technology, it's losing skilled workers, and it's losing investment from abroad. And also it's losing some markets with more people reluctant to buy from Russia, even in so-called neutral countries like China and India. A good question is, when America went to war in the Second World War, Korea and Vietnam, it caused a booming economy because increased industrial production causing a surge in demand and output and very high growth. So it's sometimes argued that war can actually increase the size of the economy. But Russia is different because it doesn't have the same industrial base. It doesn't have the ability to transform the economy from one based on fossil fuels to a dynamic manufacturing-based economy. And that's an ongoing problem for Russia in that the fossil fuel industry has accounted for around half of the government's tax revenues. It's a very significant part of the Russian economy. But this has led to a lack of investment and enterprise elsewhere in the economy. And this is particularly exacerbated by the fact that in the Russian economy, there's a lot of corruption and wasted of resources. So even if you have a corrupt economy, it's fairly easy to make money from fossil fuels because it's fairly low skilled, you don't need too much skilled labour, and you just extract the resource and sell it. It's much simpler than high-tech, high-skilled industries which require a lot of new technology and integrated with the global economy. And that's another long-term problem for the Russian economy. The whole shock of 2022 has accelerated the West's desire to get away from relying on fossil fuel imports. And although it can't happen overnight, in the long term, there's a real enthusiasm and eagerness to develop renewable energies which reduce our dependence on importing fossil fuels from Russia and other, say, Middle Eastern countries. So when the economy is based on fossil fuels, but this is in long-term decline, it will be hard for Russia to diversify the economy, especially given the sanctions and international isolation. A report by Bloomberg from an internal Russian government source shows that despite the official propaganda and official statistics, they are actually very concerned about the Russian economy. For example, the loss of imports of key technology, loss of capital, lack of investment. And they fear that in a worst case scenario, the Russian economy could fall by 12% and take over a decade to replace its 2021 peak. And it's worth bearing in mind at this point, if you have a look at the effect of sanctions in 2014, it actually caused a very serious fall in the ruble. And you can see that Russian GDP measured in dollar terms fell quite a lot and hasn't recovered. And these sanctions in 2014, in response to Crimea annexation, were relatively mild. And many people said too mild, but they still had quite an effect on reducing the ruble and the state of the Russian economy. So if mild sanctions can do this, the much more serious sanctions we see today could have a much bigger impact over the long term. And also another very important thing to mention is that Russia has tried to hurt Europe by cutting off gas supplies. But this is really playing with fire, because gas and oil exports are a really big source of Russian revenue. Over 50% of government tax revenue comes from energy exports. So by restricting gas supplies, they're kind of hitting their best consumer. And although they want to try to change to exporting to China and India, in fact, it will be hard to do this because it's very difficult to build the pipelines direct to China when they're all built to Europe. And in a way, Russia needs Europe more than Europe needs Russia, because Europe has been able to find alternatives. It has been able to import liquid petroleum gas from US and Asia. And in the coming years, it will make plans to replace Russian gas and oil completely. Also, the Russian economy has held up well because of the price of oil. And when oil prices are high, Russian economy does well. But if the world does go into a recession in 2022, in this winter, then it's quite possible that oil prices could fall quite dramatically. Let's have a look at what happened in 2008. Oil prices rose to $140. But when the recession hit, they plummeted to around $40. And if we saw anything like that recurring this winter, it would be very damaging for the Russian economy because it's very dependent on oil revenues. And also it's worth pointing out that oil in Russia is selling at a discount to the rest of the world. So it's true that China and India are still buying Russian oil, but they're buying at a discount. What about Europe? Well, the OECD say that the effect of sanctions and the gas restrictions are very damaging. They're causing a fall in global growth, and it's pushing many European economies into recession. It will particularly hit the German economy, which of course is very reliant on gas imports because of the size of its industry and their gas dependence. Now, to some extent, industry has started to find alternatives and reduce demand. But nevertheless, we see inflation of over 10% in Germany, which is unprecedented. In response, Germany are introducing a price cap, borrowing 200 billion euros to keep prices low. But there's still an underlying worry that Europe could see a shortage of gas, that with all the price caps, demand may not be reduced sufficiently and Europe may not be able to import enough. And if there was a shortage of gas and we had rationing, that could really cause serious problems, because the OECD say it could cause a very deep recession, around 4% fall in GDP, and also it could cause European unity to break down as countries try to get the precious gas supplies. Of course, here in the UK, the government is blaming a lot of its current woes on Putin and the rising price of gas. Now, of course, as we looked at in a recent video, it's also partly, well, mainly self-inflicted, the problems of the past week. But nevertheless, it does show that when oil prices rise and you get cost-push inflation, it makes it very difficult for policymakers. It gives you a worse choice. And also, as you see here, although gas and electricity prices have started to come down in recent months, that shouldn't hide the fact that they're very significantly higher than they were in the summer of 2021, more than 600% higher, record wholesale prices. And it's hard to avoid the fact that these energy prices are causing serious problems. Overall, I would say it is most likely Europe will be able to ride out this winter. It may cause a recession, in fact it may already be happening, and it will cause a lot of hardship, especially for households on low incomes who are struggling with high energy bills. But I don't feel it creates an existential threat to the European economy, because in the long term they will find alternatives to relying on Russian imports, and the economy may be stronger for that, because it will be a greater diversity of renewable energies and different electric sources that make the Europe more energy interdependent. So in the long term, this will help environmental goals, but also the economic strength, because you're not dependent on imports. For the Russian economy, things do look bleaker. Although the economy has held up relatively well, this is really because oil prices have remained high. But I'm not sure how long these high oil and gas prices will remain. If the world does go into recession in 2023, which is quite likely, you can expect oil and gas prices to fall, even if Russia cuts off its supplies to some extent. And this will be really damaging to the Russian economy, because it will reduce tax revenues, reduce GDP. And then on top of that, you have all the problems of Russia doing badly in the war, the loss of skilled men, the loss of workers, the lack of ability to import Western technology. And also the fact that if the war continues to go against Russia, it will make it harder to get help from neutral countries like China and India, who may not want to be associated with Russia's failing war effort. So it's a very unfortunate situation that the war has caused so much human hardship, and also in terms of economic hardship, both in Europe and Russia. But in the long term, the Russian economy outlook is pretty grim. Europe will have a very difficult winter, but in the long term, we'll be able to survive it. Hope you like this video. If you found it useful, please give it a thumbs up and feel free to subscribe to the channel. There'll be lots more videos coming out soon, lots to talk about. Thank you, bye.